Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, we're all good.
Okay. All right. So I've been the Calhoun County Marine Extension Agent for about a year and 3 months now. Prior to that, I had come out of Texas A&M. I was wildlife fisheries science. I spent a year working for the fisheries department at Auburn University. And then I came back to Texas and I spent 2 years working for Texas Parks and Wildlife's Coastal Fisheries Division in Port O'Connor. And then the last 25 years, I was one of the 2 environmental specialists that handled the Texas Mid-Coast for the Department of State Health Services. I did the shellfish classification for these 2 bays for the last 25 years. So this presentation will be a little bit biased towards the Middle Coast since this was the area that I was responsible for. There's 3 offices within the Texas Department of State Health Services, Seafood and Aquatic Life Group. The Port Lavaca office handles Mesquite Bay to the San Bernard River. There's an office in Bay Cliff, and they handle from the San Bernard River to the Sabine River. And then there's an office in Corpus, and they picked up Carlos Bay to the Rio Grande. A lot of people that are not connected with the oyster industry don't even realize that these activities take place. So this presentation was one that I used for several years towards the end of my career with dishes. It was used for more general audiences. So at the end, if you have any specific questions, just let me know. So this is how most people see oysters. You know, they buy oysters if they're lucky and they live on a coast or they have a decent seafood market by them. They'll see this sign, fresh local oysters. They don't know where they come from. So people ask me, how do they harvest oysters? Well, that picture is a dredge coming aboard a boat, and that's like a big heavy rake, and the boats drag it in a circle, and the oysters bounce into the dredge, and then once it comes on board, they are legally allowed to harvest any oyster over 3 inches. The small ones have to be put back. The dead shell has to be put back. And then once they're harvested on the boat, they put them in a sack, and they have to tag that sack. And this is critical. This allows the state health department to track that product all the way from the final consumer back to the boat that it was harvested on the day that it was harvested in the bay that it was harvested. In case of an illness outbreak, it allows the state health agencies to take the appropriate actions to reduce the number of people that get sick. Then once the oysters come to the dock, they are offloaded. Once that oyster hits that pallet and the forklift picks it up, it has now become the property of the dealer, the certified dealer that they are selling it to. A lot of the dealers ship just shell stock, so they'll ship the whole sack, but some of them shuck. And that's this picture you see with all the people lined up by the shucking table. This is one of the oyster facilities that's in Port Lavaca, and they are still hand shucking the oysters. The shucked product goes into the fish market, and you buy it by the gallon, the pint, or the quart. This is part of the reason why a gallon of oysters costs so much money, because they have tried to build machines to shuck oysters, and they have not been successful. The machines that they built tend to break off too many shell fragments and have the shell fragments in the meat, which would be, of course, a choking hazard. So the Texas Department of State Health Service, they get their legislative mandate from the legislature under Chapter 436 of the Health and Safety Code. DSHS is charged with the responsibility of administering the Shellfish Sanitation Program for the state of Texas. In the old days, when I went to work for them in 1994, we were the Texas Department of Health Shellfish Sanitation Control. I ended up retiring from the same agency, but it was now named the Department of State Health Services Seafood and Aquatic Life Group, because in addition to shellfish sanitation, we did handle some fish toxicology. All of the state shellfish authorities that have harvesting waters within their state, they have to operate under the National Shellfish Sanitation Program Model Ordinance. That is put out by the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference. The states can regulate the industry stricter than the model ordinance, but they cannot be more lenient. In Texas, the Shellfish Sanitation Program is a partnership between three groups: the Department of State Health Services, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and the oyster industry. So the Department of State Health Services does all the shellfish classification. They determine when and where you can harvest oysters from a human health standpoint. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Law Enforcement Division provides the law enforcement for the on-the-water activities. A lot of the enforcement at the dock is handled by dishes. And then, of course, without the cooperation of the industry, the partnership would not work, because there's only so many game wardens, and there was only 6 people on the coast that did what I did. We couldn't be everywhere all the time. We have to have cooperation from the industry, or it just wouldn't work and people would get sick. So in order to maintain proper shellfish classification for the growing waters, there's 2 things that have to be done. One is shoreline surveys, and the other main part of the program was collecting the bacteriological water samples from the classified bay waters. In shoreline surveys, for us on the Middle Coast, oyster season was November 1st to April 30th. They do have leases in Galveston. This oyster farming that's coming online is going to change everything, but the wild crop season is November 1 to April 30th. So in the summertime, we would analyze the data and we would do the shoreline surveys. And so on the shoreline surveys, the people in the field office, they've got to go in and account for housing developments, a lot of times because those housing developments are working off the septic systems. Agricultural areas, we used to contact the Texas Extension Service, and we would find out how many acres of what types of crops were grown in that county, because that would let us know what type of chemicals were being used on those crops. We would also find out how many head of cattle were in the county, and that was because a lot of the cattle that are in coastal counties graze down near the bay. So of course there is the potential for fecal coliform to enter the water in grazing areas. We track wildlife management areas, we track bird rookeries, we track marinas. The big reason for tracking marinas is there is people that live aboard boats, and you had to be able to account for the fact that they may discharge sanitary wastewater overboard. We also tracked industrial discharges from plants, industrial plants, as well as sanitary wastewater treatment plant outfalls. And the way we would handle the sanitary wastewater plant outfalls and the industrial discharges is we would contact the TCEQ, which was the lead agency for that, and we would make sure that the people that they were licensing were not having any problems. But you also had to build up a relationship with the wastewater treatment plant operators that have the plants that are right on the coast, like Seadrift, Port Lavaca, Palacios, because they're close enough to the growing area that if that plant had a bypass during oyster season, we needed to know about it immediately. We didn't have time for them to go to TCQ, then it's go all the way up to Austin, and come back to us. By that time, bad product would be out on the marketplace and people would be getting sick. So usually if those operators had a problem, they would call me. This is just an example of the water sample stations in San Antonio Bay. All the red dots, each red dot is a water sample station. When we made this sampling run, it was Espiritu Santo, San Antonio, Mesquite Bay. We would do it. It was a 108-mile trip. We would do the 108 miles, pick up 32 samples, and we had to do it in under 4 hours because we had to get the samples overnight air to the lab. Each sample station that is on the bay for shellfish classification is either monitoring a pollution source or it's checking for dilution to make sure that any pollution source that came in would be diluted before it got into the growing area. One of the old sayings we used to use is the solution to pollution is dilution. There's 3 types of water sample stations. There's restricted stations. Those are in these areas that are dotted. There was conditionally approved stations. Those are these areas that have lines on them. And then approved stations. These are on the middle Texas coast. We also had a prohibited classification. You'll see that up in Galveston, and you'll see it on the Matagorda Bay map over in Oyster Lake. But restricted station, there was no harvesting allowed there at all during the oyster season. On a conditionally approved station like TX27, those stations meet National Shellfish Sanitation Program approved water standards under certain conditions. In the case of TX27, when the Guadalupe River at Bloomington is under 24 feet, that area can stay open. As soon as it jumps over 24 feet, that area automatically closes down until we could go in there, collect water samples. The water samples came back good, and the oysters had 4 days to purge themselves. There was research done that shows that it takes an oyster 4 days to pump itself fully clean. That's how we got that number. If we went out and we collected the water sample stations and one of them in TX27, one of the conditional stations was bad, the whole area had to stay closed. Part of the problem with Texas is because Texas bays are relatively shallow and they're behind barrier islands, they don't have really good water exchange. We don't have 6-foot tides here. We're lucky to have an 18-inch tide. So when a cold front comes in onto the Texas coast and stalls out in the winter and drops a whole bunch of rain up and down the coast, it can shut down a lot of these harvesting areas. And since there was only 2 of us and we covered a pretty wide swath of area, it might take us a week or 2 to be able to get to all the areas. If they came back bad, we'd have to come back and do it again the next week. And back in the peak of my time working, the governor's office had some economic data that put the cost of us shutting down the industry at $1 million a week coastwide. So we had to go regardless of the weather. We were out there. So the conditional areas shut down on their management plan criteria. That's off of water samples that are analyzed. The approved areas, which are like TX 26, 25, 24, they stay open almost all the time. They will only close down if you have an extreme flood situation that is outside of your ability to predict what the water quality will be. They also shut down most likely on a harmful algae bloom situation, or if you get a high result for some reason, or a wastewater treatment plant failure. If the plant bypasses into an approved area, that approved area will be shut down. The bay water samples are collected 2 feet below the surface. They're collected by screwing an autoclavable bottle onto a PVC sampling wand so that you never touch the top of that bottle. You had to protect it from contamination. They were placed on ice inside of cages so they could not fall over, and they are shipped FedEx overnight to the Department of State Health Services micro lab in Austin. Every sample that was collected also had a salinity and conductivity and temperature information and weather data collected with it. The main extra piece of data that could leave an area shut down is the salinity. If the salinity was less than 2 parts per thousand, then that sample would be invalid and the area could not reopen. The reason for that is there was research done that when the salinity drops less than 2 parts per thousand, the oysters do not pump water through themselves as much as they would when it's above 2 parts per thousand. So then we could not guarantee that the 4-day period would allow the oysters to pump themselves clean. So if salinity was below 2 after an area shut down, that area stayed shut down until the salinity came above 2 and the sample came back good. Once the samples were collected, they're put on ice. This is how they arrive at the lab. There's the cage, there's the blue ice blocks around them. The samples had to arrive at the lab within 30 hours. And when they get to the lab, that little yellow thing in that bottle is checking the temperature. They had to be within a certain temperature range. If they were out of range, the whole batch was thrown out and not run. If they arrived 1 minute late, the batch was thrown out and they were not run. This does become a problem when the shipper loses your samples and the bay is shut down. We have had situations where that has happened and it has cost the industry a lot of money. And there's not anything that we could do about it. One of the other things that we were involved with is harmful algae bloom sampling. Myself and my coworker, Kurt Behringer, I'm pretty sure that we collected and analyzed more red tide and dinophysis samples than anyone in the state of Texas. Part of the reason was because prior to 1996, red tide events were fairly rare. There was an event in '86. I started working for the health department in '94. We had the first red tide event in '96 down here, and I had to get a crash course on how to ID it and count the sample myself because our Galveston office was able to fall back to Texas A&M at Galveston to get help on that. And our Corpus office had UT Port Aransas for help. But we're in Port Lavaca, we're out in the middle of nowhere. We had to learn how to do it ourselves. And so we got a crash course and we got standardized on how to do it. And then you started running 96, 97, 2000. We started having more and more frequent red tide events. And then later on in my career, the dinophysis showed up in Texas and we started having to deal with that. Red tide is caused by Carina brevis. It tends to show up in Texas in late summer or early fall. It only takes 5 cells per milliliter for us to have to shut down the shellfish harvesting areas. To give you an example, 5,000 cells per milliliter is what it takes for you to be able to see it. And usually it takes around 5,000 cells per milliliter for it to kill fish. So the problem that we were always dealing with is the public was not seeing this and they were not seeing fish dying and they were wondering why we had the shellfish areas closed. The reason why it takes such a small amount of cells to close the shellfish area is because those oysters are pumping water through themselves over 50 gallons a day. So they bioaccumulate that toxin in the tissue. And since you eat the entire oyster, you get the concentrated toxin. And Carina brevis causes neurotoxic shellfish poisoning if you eat an oyster that's contaminated with it. It's a pretty nasty issue. It lasts about 3 days. In addition to the typical vomiting, diarrhea, cramping, you will also have a reversal of sensations because this is a neurotoxin. So you'll stick your hand in hot water and think it's cold, and your extremities will tingle and they'll go numb. So you can imagine that this freaks out emergency room physicians when people walk in with these symptoms. So typically what we would do is as soon as we knew there was some Carina brevis off of Texas, we would put a press release out to the Texas Medical Association so that it would go to all the doctors that work along the coast and in the inland areas. So if someone showed up at their ER with these symptoms, they would at least know enough to ask, have you eaten oysters? The brevetoxin cannot be cooked out of the oyster. So, you know, cooking does no good. It's not like bacteria where you could cook it long enough to kill it. We did have one case. It happened to be in Calhoun County, where there was an individual that consumed some brevetoxin tainted oysters. Um, they thought they could cook it out. They ended up in the hospital, and CDC flew some people into Port Lavaca to interview that individual and to check all their tests, because you can't force feed people toxic shellfish to see what happens to them. But when they eat it on their own, they definitely took advantage and sent the scientists in to see what was happening to that person. So the other algae bloom that we had to deal with towards the end of my time there was Dinophysis. And Dinophysis is a springtime harmful algae bloom. It causes diuretic shellfish poisoning, which the main symptoms, diarrhea, cramping. You cannot cook that out either. And for both of these harmful algae, you had to have water samples less than 5 cells per mil before you could even take meat samples. But then before you can reopen the growing area, you had to collect oyster meat. And that's what's in this bottle right here. That's an oyster sample. It's dated. There's a lat long on it. It goes to the state lab in Austin, and then they extract the toxin off of that oyster meat with ether. It's a pretty dangerous test. They hated doing it at the lab. They had to do it under these big hoods. And then the toxin is injected into mice. And the mice have to be just the right size range. If they're too big or too little, it won't qualify. And it's an LD50 test on the mice. So they inject the mice with different concentrations, and they see how long it takes them to die. And, you know, you cannot reopen the area until you have a result of no toxin present. The first time that I dealt with red tide in 1996, we did not have cell phones. We didn't even have a reliable internet connection, but that was my first time seeing Tony's name, because Tony had the red tide rangers down in the valley, and we would see their results that were coming up from the valley, which was very helpful for us because our closest guys were in Corpus. And then we were doing the sampling, you know, in Corpus, in Port O'Connor, and in Galveston. But the real game changer with the harmful algae was sometime around 15 or so years ago. Dr. Lisa Campbell from Texas A&M put the Hyderbot out there. And I think that that was a Texas Sea Grant funded project. And that instrument, there was one in Galveston and there was one at the UT Port Aransas Pier, and it takes pictures of all the algae that come by, and it would send them up to College Station, and there would be a grad student sitting out there, sitting at a console, looking at the screen, and when they would see any of the harmful algae species, we would get contacted, and that would tell us to send the boats out and start sampling. Before that, we had no way of knowing that this stuff was coming in until fish started dying or people started experiencing respiratory distress with red tide. I guarantee that that prevented a lot of illnesses, and it still does to this day. It created a lot of extra work for me because all of a sudden we're having to run out there constantly when before we didn't even know that stuff was coming in. But it definitely saved a lot of people from getting sick, which in turn should have saved the industry a ton of money. Okay, so at the end of the year, you take your shoreline data and you would take your water quality data, and the field crews would write up the sanitary surveys. In Texas, Texas is more strict than the model ordinance requires. In Texas, they do a comprehensive survey every 6 years. The federal requirement is only every 12 years, but the Texas coast is changing so fast that we didn't want to let it go 12 years. We didn't think that that was the best thing to do from a health standpoint. So every 6 years, all the water quality data and all the shoreline surveys are analyzed like you've never seen them before. And that's how the shellfish lines are drawn. And then every 3 years, you come in and you do a triennial reevaluation, which looks at the past 3 years' data, and it modifies any management plans for conditionally improved areas. Like, for instance, in San Antonio Bay, where the Guadalupe's management plan trigger was 24 foot at Bloomington, at one point in time, that was 20 foot. And then the data allowed us to take it up to 24. And shoreline surveys are redone on the 3-year survey. And then every year for every bay in the state of Texas, there's an annual update, and it just reviews the last year's data. It makes sure that it was in compliance with the NSSP model ordinance. We update new pollution sources. So if there was a new subdivision that came in, or a new industrial plant, new aquaculture facility, it would be noted. And we would just run some checks on the management plans to make sure that they were operating like they're supposed to. The end product of the surveys is these shellfish maps. And I think Nicole has a link she can put in the chat for you so that you can get these maps yourself. On the front of the map shows all the harvesting areas, but it makes sure you print the back, because on the back of all the maps is the legal descriptions to go with all the lines. About 15 years ago, we had some judges start to uphold GPS lat longs, and of course GPS became commonplace on the oyster boats. So most of the points that make up a shellfish line have a GPS lat long on back of the map. That's so that the oyster boat captains can plug that into their machine and be able to see where the line is when it's foggy or when it's dark. These are the maps that I was responsible for out of the Port Lavaca office, just to give you an idea. This is the ones that the Mid-Coast handles. Within the State Health Department, the Department of State Health Services Seafood and Aquatic Life Group is the only group where the federal report is written in the field office. And the reason for that is because we were writing these maps and we were making these lines, which then become law. And you couldn't have someone in Austin doing that, because a lot of times when we were writing the descriptions of the line, we'd have to go jump in the boat and go double check something to make sure that what we were writing is what we were seeing. And so this is kind of unique. Most of the other agencies, the federal reports are written out of Austin, but within DISH's SALG, they're written in the field office. So like earlier I had said, Parks and Wildlife provides enforcement. This picture on the left with the game warden, this is Calhoun County Warden Ben Bailey, and the guy in front of the boat is one of the warden's mechanics. I had gotten a call that day. This is down in front of Powderhorn Lake, and Ben was down there on a truck patrol, and he called me, and there was an oyster boat that he thought was in restricted water, but he wasn't sure. So I ran down there, and I'm actually behind a fence taking this picture. This boat was in restricted water. This was only about 4 or 5 years ago. It was easy for me to send him a quick text message. Yes, he is restricted. And then the mechanic ran down with the boat, put it in, he jumped in, and this boat captain ended up going to jail. So when a boat is in closed water, they go to jail. And the boat had to come up the shoreline about 10 miles. And so I ran around to the fish market at the City Harbor in Port Lavaca and got a picture of the Sheriff's Department sending the van down to take them in. Didn't used to be that they went to jail, and the problem was that some of the fines were the cost of doing business. Well, you can kill people. You can not only get them sick harvesting from restricted water, but if they've got certain medical conditions, you can kill them. So fortunately, several legislative sessions ago, some of the state representatives determined that it was in the best interest to stiffen the fines. And so at first they made it to where the captain went to jail. And then we had a problem with the boats playing musical captains. They throw another one in there. But then it went back the next session and the whole crew went to jail. And that stopped the problem because a lot of the workers that are on the oyster boats are coming in on work visas from Mexico. And when they're on a boat that's in closed water and they go to jail, that's a Class B felony. When they get a Class B felony, not only are they in jail, but then Customs and Border Patrol comes to jail, picks them up, and sends them back and revokes that visa. And then the boat owner does not have any more workers. So that did solve our problem after that happened. Once or twice, they realized it's not worth it. So once a year, the state is evaluated by FDA to check for compliance with the Shellfish Sanitation Program. They would come down and they would go out with me and Kirk over here on the health department boat for a week. They would make sure that we have our sample stations in the right places, that we collected the right number of samples, that we had the bay lines in the right places, that we analyzed the data correctly, that everything met their criteria. Then they would go for a week up to the state lab. They would send a lab evaluation officer from FDA into the lab, make sure that they were doing everything right. And then they would spend a week with the wardens, and they would go out on patrols with the wardens. And not only would they make sure that the wardens were patrolling and that the industry was abiding by the rules, but they would also follow through and make sure that when the wardens write a ticket, it goes through the county court system, because Class B is a county court violation. If the county court at law judge is not prosecuting that case, then that's a failure on that end and can cause a problem. The reason why it's critical that the state be in compliance with the NSSP is because if any one of us failed our portion of that annual inspection, then FDA could take the state of Texas off the interstate shellfish shippers list. What that means is no oysters could leave the state of Texas. And the majority of the oysters harvested in Texas, this is an older number, but I bet it's still pretty close. 95% of the oysters harvested in Texas used to be shipped out of state, and I'll bet it's still pretty close to that. So you can understand that if either the health department or the wardens or the lab or the judicial system failed and got the state of Texas kicked off the shippers list, you would devastate the oyster industry, because there would be, you can't sell enough oysters in Texas to offset what's going out of state. Some of the biggest states that consume Texas oysters are Connecticut, New York, and Florida. Most people go to those states thinking they're eating a local oyster, and they're eating a Texas oyster. So just to give you a little quick update on the health risks, because I couldn't do something like this without it. So these are factors that will increase your risk for getting Vibrio from raw oysters. Vibrio is probably the most critical illness that people get from raw oysters. It does kill people every year. You know, any kind of immunocompromised position, liver disease, cancer. There's a couple other odd ones in there, like the steroid dependency, the iron metabolism. Those were figured out relatively recently. But as a sea grant agent, and even as when I worked for the health department, the more we can educate the public about this, that maybe people with these conditions should eat cooked oysters, because if you have Vibrio in an oyster, you can cook it out with enough heat, then they don't get sick, they don't potentially die. And if there's two illnesses associated with one growing area, one of the TX numbers, it shuts down. So it costs the industry money. It's a lot cheaper and it's a lot better in the long run to educate the consumers that should avoid raw oysters to avoid them. So the state health department does go to some medical conventions every year, try to talk to the doctors, so the doctors will remember if they have a patient with one of these conditions, tell them not to eat a raw oyster. if you have oysters and you have any kind of condition and you're concerned, here's the cooking tips that will reduce your chance of illness right here. Basically, you know, heat will take care of everything except for when they're contaminated with harmful algae, whether that be dinophysis, whether it be K. brevis, or whatever the next new one is to come into Texas, which I have a feeling even in my lifetime I will see it, because the global shipping is moving algae all over the world quick enough that when it comes out in ballast water, it finds a niche and it will do well. So if you've got any concerns, keep your heat at these levels for these time frames and you should be okay. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you so much, RJ. While people think of their questions, I'm going to put out another poll for y'all to fill out if y'all don't mind. Let's see here. Where'd it go? All right. Awesome. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. All right, if no one has any questions, I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, RJ. I learned a lot. That was really, really interesting. For all of our viewers, we will be posting this recording, and stay tuned to all of our social medias for when we post when our next Seaside Chat will be. Thanks. Oh, wait, we do have a question. Awesome. Wait, I'll just hold off then. It's down in the chat box, RJ.
Okay, I see I have a question, but I don't see. Oh, let's see. What question? Yeah, absolutely. So the question, do you see more waters becoming restricted due to water quality over time compared to the early years? Yes, without a doubt. And the reason is it's not that per se water quality is getting worse. The technology with the wastewater plants is better than it used to be. But one of the things that I didn't go into on this one, any of the marinas and the wastewater treatment plants, the state regulatory authority that handles shellfish classification is required to put closed safety zones around them. And the way you calculate the safety zone is it's an Excel sheet that comes in from FDA. And so you look at, like, if it's a marina, how many boats are in the marina, how many liveaboards are in the marina, what's the depth of the receiving water. So of course, the more boats, the more liveaboards, your area that you have to keep restricted is going to expand further out into the bay. And same thing with wastewater treatment plants. The more volume that comes into a wastewater treatment plant on the upside, which would be, let's say, from more houses, then your calculation to put the buffer zone is going to be bigger. And so you're going to have to restrict more acres of bay to harvest. And the reason for those closed safety zones is that the regulators cannot be out there 24 hours a day. And so you had to have a little buffer in there so that if you had a bypass, you didn't get people sick. And so basically, Short answer, the more the coast gets developed, the more the coastal waters will be closed off. It may not be that the water quality gets worse, it's just that the closed safety zones will expand out because of the requirement on the model ordinance. I hope that answered it.
Does anyone else have any questions? All right, well, if y'all don't have any questions, I'll just go ahead and end this webinar. Thanks again to everyone who joined us, and thank you so much, RJ, for that presentation. It was super interesting. Stay tuned on the social medias when we post when our next one will be. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye.